So good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming. This is the first in a series of talks that I hope will inspire you, get you excited about all kinds of issues in the city of Brampton. We heard earlier that Brampton has a bright future, and I believe that. And I want to thank our future-ready folks from the city of Brampton for being here tonight, and for all the other nights that they're out talking to our residents. I want to thank my office staff in the mayor's office for putting this event together. So I want to just tell you a little bit about how this got inspired. Before I ran for mayor, a gentleman named Gil Penalosa came and spoke at the Rose Theatre before I became mayor. He represents an organization called 8 and 80. And he talked that evening about all that Brampton and other cities could be, whether they're pedestrian, cycle-friendly, accessible cities. And he talked about Brampton in a way that I had never heard it talked about before. And what he did is he inspired me, and he helped inform my platform when I ran for mayor. He still inspires my platform. And these evenings are like a TED Talk for Brampton, a bread maybe, rather than a TED. I'm hoping that it inspires you and causes you to feel more engaged in your community. I represent 600,000 people, very diverse, highly educated, very young community. I'm lucky to do it, but I don't have all the bright ideas. So tonight we are here with a team of people who I hope will help all of us think outside the box, talk about all that Brampton can, should, and could be. And I encourage you to participate. There are no stupid questions, and I'm always looking for good ideas to be a better representative. And I thank you for spending an evening with us and stretching what your thoughts are of what a suburb can and will be. We're very excited about where Brampton's going in the future. We have Ryerson University coming, and you'll hear more about that before the end of the year. But there's lots of exciting things on the horizon, and tonight is one of those first baby steps into having people think about Brampton in a very different way, in a very positive way. So thank you for being here tonight. And Jaskaran, the floor is yours.
Huge round of applause for Madam Mayor Linda Jeffrey. Thank you, Madam Mayor. So welcome to the Mayor Speaker Series here at Lab B in downtown Brampton. And we're thankful to our media partners, Brampton Focus, who are providing the live stream that you're watching right now. We're also very thankful to our event sponsors and partners, Spacing Magazine. Matt, thank you very much. A big round of applause for Matt. Look, it's very important to pump people up, you know. That's thank you, Matt. And thank you for all the Spacing Magazines you provided to all participants here. And for those watching at home, head over to Spacing Magazine. Just Google it. You find the website. Some great content on urban planning and design. Today, I have with me three wonderful speakers. But before I get to them, just a couple more thank yous I want to give. These type of events are impossible without the community coming together. And it really is a community event and a community initiative. So I want to thank Trax Brew Pub, who are next door for the high chairs that you're sitting on. So thank you very much, Trax. Gem Studios, who have provided some of the audio speaker equipment that is making today possible. Lab B, again, for the space. And Nothing Design Studio, which is a designing space here in Lab B, who have been very helpful, and Rahul. So having said that, for the viewers at home that are watching online, please send your questions. Either you can tweet at us, you can tweet at the mayor, at Linda Jeffrey. You can use the hashtag BramptonFuture. You can respond underneath the live video on Facebook. There's multiple ways you can contact us. Don't worry, we'll find you if you ask us something. The three speakers here are distinguished guests with us today to speak about urban planning and the broad theme of brave new suburbia, right? And that is very loose-ended for a reason, because it's a developing field with a lot of different ideas. So having said that, I'm going to briefly introduce the three. Then we're going to ask each of them to speak for no more than 5 minutes about what a brave new suburbia means to them, right? Where have we come from? What are some of the mistakes? And where can we go forward? At that point, we're going to open up the floor to Q&A. And for those watching online, sending your questions, we will also hit up some of those questions as well, and we'll keep the conversation moving till 8:30. So I have here beside me Mr. Graham Haynes. He brings experience working in the public, private, and NGO sectors to the Ryerson City Building Institute. Over the course of his career, Graham has carried out research and authored reports on a wide range of urban issues, including transportation, economics, development charges, renewable energy policy, and climate change mitigation. A total hoax, by the way. He holds an MPI in urban development and a BASc in engineering science, specializing in infrastructure engineering. A round of applause for Graham. Thank you for being here. Dr. Jisi Sheng is an associate professor at Ryerson University School of Urban and Regional Planning and a registered professional planner practicing here in Ontario, Canada. Her current research projects explore suburban ethnic placemaking practices in the Greater Toronto Area and how municipalities could enhance the advantages of ethno-cultural diversity for suburban retrofitting and exclusive community building. So here in Brampton, we call it the Greater Brampton Area. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for being here. A round of applause, GC. Last but not least, we have Mr. Yusuf Shah. He's a consultant at Hempson Consulting Limited, where he supports the planning practice and the demographic forecasting and planning advisory services. He has previously worked in the planning policy with the City of Ottawa, development policy with the United Nations in Pakistan, and in commercial construction management in the United States of America. Yusuf is a registered professional planner and a lead accredited professional. Thank you for being here today. So I'm going to work this way down. In under 5 minutes, your views on a brave new suburbia.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's pretty exciting. I'm going to start with first a bit of a confession. I had never been to Brampton before today.
So you can grab a samosa on the way out right
I'll
now.
See you later.
Anyone here who want to sit up here instead? That's.
So I actually made sure I got here early so I could walk around downtown Brampton for what it is, which was interesting to do. The first thing that sort of struck me as I sort of prepared for this event and then again walked through downtown was how much it reminded me of the city of Regina, where I grew up and recently worked for 2 years. I mean, city of Regina is maybe a bit more of an established city than somewhere like Brampton that has grown more in the last 20 to 30 years, whereas the city of Regina is very well established. But like Brampton, it's very sprawly. I mean, almost 100% of Regina's growth is happening on its periphery, just like Brampton. It doesn't have the most active downtown compared to other cities like Brampton. So it just reminded me a lot. So as I walked around, there were a lot of things that came to mind. I mean, number one, Brampton didn't have a great water source like Regina. You're on a creek, kind of exciting. But it's challenging to be a pedestrian here, even in downtown. And that was the first thing that struck me was no matter where I went, I had to push a button to cross the street. Didn't matter if I was going to a park, if I was crossing sort of like the main intersections downtown, I had to push a button. And that's the same thing as Regina. So right from the get-go as a pedestrian downtown, where a pedestrian should be most comfortable, I felt uncomfortable. Felt like I wasn't meant to be there. And I think that's sort of one of the biggest things the suburbs have to grapple with is for so long they've been built to be places for the car and nothing else, that we've stripped them of being comfortable, familiar to pedestrians. So to me, that's sort of step one of retrofitting the suburbia and Brave New Suburbia is how do we make everywhere in the suburbs, not just downtown, but the communities we're building, the existing communities, more friendly to pedestrians. I think there's a lot of other things we can touch on, the transit debates that are starting to happen and figuring out how we give people better opportunities to get around without a car. But to me, sort of retrofitting the suburbia is what Brave New Suburbia looks like, is getting that pedestrian realm right everywhere. So it's easy for me to talk about my experience downtown, but I think it's even more challenging once we get outside of downtown, once you're in your communities. I can speak about my experience growing up in the city of Regina, and you can't walk anywhere. If you want to go to a corner store as a kid, there's not a lot of neighborhoods where that's actually a feasible thing to do. And that's where it has to start. So I mean, Brampton is, what excites me about Brampton and why I think this is such an exciting event is Brampton has a huge opportunity. It's growing so fast. There's so many newcomers to Brampton every year that there's an opportunity here that cities like Regina don't have. With 10,000 new people coming here every single year, there is a massive opportunity to make Brampton be what you want it to be. There's growth that's going to happen now and for a long time, and that just gives you so much of an opportunity that I think almost every city in Canada would be jealous to have. It's huge, and I'm excited to see what the conversation is tonight and excited to see the future of Brampton.
GC?
Hello, thank you very much for having me here tonight. And before joining Ryerson, I actually worked with the regional municipality of Peel. So I used to work in Brampton. And
round of applause, guys.
Yeah.
After we were just embarrassed, you got to reward these type of things.
And I live in Markham, so tell me about the suburbs. I raised my kids there in Markham as well. I work in downtown Toronto. So yes, and I've been working on my research focusing on suburban placemaking as well as immigrant settlement and diversity issues. And I've been telling my students, for the next 20, 30 years, it's your job to retrofit suburbs. And it's also the municipal agenda everywhere, pretty much down the road in the next 20, 30 years. This is the first priority, to recreate the very dynamic suburban spaces. In like our perception of suburbs, generally speaking, it's very homogeneous places, very stereotypically homogeneous suburban place, but in reality, that's not true. If you look at demographics, so many things have changed. If you look at Toronto, the foreign-born population is slightly lower than 50%. But if you look at Mississauga, Brampton, and Richmond Hill, Markham, all over 55%. That's the data in 2011, and the 2016 data is going to be released this month. So I'm expecting like a higher percentage of foreign-born population in many of these suburban municipalities. What does that really mean to urban spaces? That's what my research has been focusing on in the last couple of years, and I've been looking at ethnic retelling, ethnic neighborhoods across the GTA, especially in the suburban areas, and look at how diversity has brought forth challenges and opportunities for suburban municipalities, especially how immigrant communities have transformed urban spaces, urban forms, and urban structure. How does that impact municipal infrastructure and services? And also how has it created lots of opportunities or lots of diverse needs for public space, for example, or for community services? So I've identified, like, for example, 4,000 businesses, especially the businesses operated by immigrants across the GTA. And I've identified case studies in Etobicoke, Scarborough, or Brampton, and Mississauga, and Richmond Hill, and Markham, especially these municipalities with high percentage of immigrant population. So the finding is interesting because diversity is a beautiful thing. We all embrace multiculturalism here in Canada, but also it has like different interpretation of diversity. And with some of the interviews I got says that yes, it's very diverse. This area is very diverse, spatially very mixed, but socially segregated or fragmented. And how do we really create or develop this kind of inclusive communities? And how do we create these shared common interests in our urban spaces? And to make it meaningful and welcoming and inclusive to everyone. So that's one part of my research focuses. And the other thing I would like to emphasize is that suburban retrofitting, it's really like we are talking about bringing that urban dynamics back to the suburban setting. There's so much more we can do. Density, transit, public realm, it's really creating these shared public spaces in the suburb. And I think we have lots of things, exciting things we can do, we can work on. And I'm actually making a short documentary right now. It's called Suburbia. Suburban placemaking amidst diversity. So I'm looking at this global connection happening in the suburban spaces and how we see diversity as an advantage and how do we enhance this advantage to retrofit our suburban areas. So it will be releasing pretty soon. So I'm hoping to to have a little bit promotion right now. But that's like, basically this is like to the heart of my research, and really like that's my focus on the suburban areas in terms of diversity, in terms of building inclusive community, and that's pretty much what I'm focusing on right now. And I've done my 3-hour lecture today, and so I'm done with this 5 minutes talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yusuf.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here, and I'm really glad you two went first, because for people who don't know what Hempson Consulting does, we're the numbers people, and we think a lot in terms of numbers, and I was told that a lot of people don't really do that as a default mode. So you guys kind of put in a lot of the words that I was trying to think of. I'm like, okay, how do I describe the region in numbers that I've been running through my head? One of the things I was really interested in when you invited me for this talk was trying to dissect this idea of suburbia and what it means in the GTA context. Because we're really, in the traditional sense, when we think about suburbia, it's like sort of an offshoot to another urban center. And as I look at some of the numbers that we've been examining, it's kind of shocking to see the scale and size of the region of Peel, the city of Mississauga, and the city of Brampton within the context of the GTA. So rather than throwing out numbers, I figured I'd come up with some comparators and see, okay, what is Brampton like? What is Mississauga like? Caledon's a little bit different, but I focus on those two. And I think if we think about Mississauga today in terms of size, the city of Mississauga, as far as its people, is larger than the city of Winnipeg. The city of Brampton is almost the size of the city of Vancouver in terms of people. So these aren't like this commuter suburbs in the classic North American sense. There's a real agglomeration that exists here on its own. When we think about the future of the region of Peel, we're going to be approaching the size of this greater Vancouver area in 2041. So it's going to be quite a tremendous amount of growth, and I think there's a chance for the region to really play itself and see itself as like a real cohesive unit, to have its own identity rather than being an offshoot within the GTAH. And when you look at some of the broader numbers and some of the trends that have been happening recently, like even looking at what the city of Mississauga and city of Brampton could be like within 26 years, you're approaching the size of the city of Ottawa or the city of Edmonton today. So there's a tremendous amount of growth, and how that breaks down in terms of its people, one of the things I also do a lot of is look at migration numbers. Who's coming in and who's leaving? And it's mostly broken down by age groups, because we love to talk about millennials and the boomers and the Gen Xers. And when you look at the GTA and break it down by separate tier municipalities, one of the things that's really striking is how Toronto is very concentrated in terms of a whole lot of young people moving in and a lot of other people moving out. But when you look at the other municipalities of the GTA, it's a fairly broad spectrum of every age group moving to these cities. And so it really speaks to the opportunity that exists to create these complete communities in the future within Peel, York, Halton, Durham, and Hamilton. And in terms of also, we talk about the shifts within the housing and how we have this sort of a pattern of low density housing that has existed in the region, but when we look at some of the policy goals we've put in place for the future, we're moving to a higher density future. But looking at the last 10 years, it's fascinating to see like that's kind of already been happening. And when you break down housing development in the GTHA over five-year periods, you start to see that prior to 2006, there was a massive amount of low-rise, single-detached housing being built. And then immediately after 2006, I mean, you can say the recession was partly responsible for that, but the number of single-detached housing and low-density housing we built has dropped significantly, and other types of housing have been coming up. And then in the last 5 years, that trend has continued on. So it'll be really exciting to see how these regions these municipalities within the GTA come into their own, especially Peel region and Brampton, and shifting the housing patterns away from this traditional low density type to a much more diverse mix and range. That's kind of something that I'm personally very excited to see as we've been doing this visioning exercise with the region and with the city, to see how it rolls out in the future.
I'll get the conversation rolling. Again, for those watching online, feel free to tweet and Facebook. I'm not being rude, all right? This is what I'm doing. So shoot it over. I'll take a look. I'll ask the questions. For those in the crowd, if you can just signal with the hand, I'll more than happy to direct the question to you and say it out loud, and I'll repeat it. But just to get the conversation going, we kind of touched on this retrofitting suburbs. And for a city like Brampton, which still has a lot of developable land, wide swaths of land, and there's that going on, as well as like infill projects or redeveloping or retrofitting what we have. Brampton, as of today, is projected to have close to 1 million people by the mid-2040s. All right, so that's only 20, 30 years away from now. And you bring that fact up with a lot of residents and citizens, and not just Brampton. You go to 9 to 5 cities across the GTA who are experiencing similar growth. How does that even look? Like, how do you even fit that many people with the current paradigms that we exist under in suburbs? And that's an open question to all of you, but GC, if you want to start, because you did mention retrofitting a couple of times.
Okay. I think I don't have like a magic answer to this question right away, but I think the potential of suburban retrofitting is that it's getting so diverse. Our suburban municipalities getting so diverse. Our communities are getting so diverse, and there are advantages of such diversity. So when it comes to retrofitting the suburban spaces, there's a need to really understand what the needs and what are the needs of the communities. And I think there's it's by estimate there will be like a higher immigrant population going to the suburbs, and then there's I think it's a very important piece for municipalities to consider is how to outreach to those communities. And we have the potential for redevelopment. We have the potential to intensify the areas, the suburban areas. We have lands, and we have under the redevelopment pressure, for example. But then the one thing that is missing right now, just based on my research findings, is that municipalities tend to kind of like the tendency is that we don't really understand what the communities want and need. Because our communities are becoming so diverse, and there are so many interests in terms of public lands, in terms of public spaces, and what actually do our communities need? And there's this process in terms of how to engage communities and get their voice heard, and that actually informed municipal decision making. So I think that's one piece. I think, yes, we are under the pressure for growth. We have the undeveloped lands, and we have the underutilized spaces. How are we going to retrofit these spaces? The very important thing is that I believe is to listen to our communities and understand the local context, understand the needs of local communities. I think right now across the board, I'm not just talking about Brampton, I'm thinking like just going back to my research findings, the data actually points to the lack of understanding of very diverse needs from our local communities. So I think there's something we can actually, everyone has a role to play.
So, and I'll put this question to our consultant here, the private sector guy. So Yusuf, we talk about communicating and understanding what communities need or how we can develop the future. What roles do developers play in this, right? Like they have market forces that they'll argue that dictate what they need to build. So what's the relationship here, and what's the expectation on developers and cities?
I think historically it's kind of been seen as a very, very adversarial relationship of a developer deciding, we have our own interest to shoot for, and those can often not align with what the public may want or what the city may want. But I think a lot of it, the way we've seen kind of the market heading is that there's so much growth coming into the region in terms of just how many people are going to be moving here, that the traditional development dynamics will kind of have to change. And I think you kind of see some of the developers recognizing that and kind of moving along with it. So it'll be more of a negotiation, and it often is more of a negotiation. Really, it's really coming forward and having those discussions with the industry, as well as getting the public involved within the planning and visioning side. So yeah, that's really where we can place it. Is like it often the best neighborhoods often come out of negotiations. As we found.
Is there, Graham, maybe you see this with the City Building Institute in Ryerson, is there any example of suburbs getting it right, or developments or projects that are currently underway that are getting it right? And Markham is often mentioned as a city that's kind of trying to build it downtown. Mississauga has a bit of what's going on at Square One, but there's a lot of critics as well. So is there a project or something that you would highlight as, okay, this is something that's right in the GTA, but maybe even outside of it?
I don't have like specific examples that jump to mind, but I mean, you've brought up a few, like the Mississauga downtown, the Markham downtown. But I think more and more we're starting to see, especially close to transit, major transit, there's starting to be more dense development. So stuff like townhouses, stuff that isn't just single detached. And I think that's particularly important in the GTA, because we're starting to find if you want to live in a single detached house, that's almost impossible if you want to live close to Toronto. I mean, even Brampton, it's something like $600,000 if you want a detached house.
If you're lucky.
If you're okay, so yeah, if you're lucky. So I mean, if you're a new you're a new resident, a young resident that wants to live in the GTA, that single detached neighborhood that we're used to building, that politicians are used to approving, that developers are comfortable with, that's probably not going to work for you anymore. So we're starting to see some of it close to transit, especially close to transit, these sort of townhouse-based neighborhoods that have a mix of development opportunities. And it's slowly happening. And I think those are sort of where the future of the suburbs lie, is these communities that start out with a bit more density from the ground up. You're not starting from this huge lots, huge single detached houses, but you're actually starting with a more entry-level home given the price of the market. I don't know if others have.
Well, no, and just a follow-up actually, and you mentioned that this was the first time you're in Brampton and you explored downtown Brampton a bit. Shame on you, but we'll let it go. You've seen some examples here. We've seen some condos are going up here. There's a bit of a development going on in downtown Brampton right now. And there's a kind of conversations about the Ryerson University and maybe an innovation center and a new central library. Looking at downtown Brampton, if you could have the ears of our planning department, which you may have here, and you can give some suggestions on how to better build a relationship of not just downtown, but connecting to the rest of the city that circles the downtown here. How would you go about doing that? And I know that's a broad question, but you take that into a direction that you think kind of, does a good job of merging those two dynamics.
Okay. I mean, I highlighted one thing that I think is important. It's just making downtown Brampton more pedestrian friendly from the get-go, because I think making it somewhere people want to be will also attract development. So I mean, starting from just some basics that will make Brampton downtown a more attractive place to be all the time, whether it's after work, on weekends, I think that's a big start. Number two, I think get rid of any parking requirements you have for downtown. I don't know that you have any, but I would suggest getting rid of those. That doesn't mean that developers are not going to build any parking, because they know people drive in Brampton. So they're not going to show up with buildings that don't have parking because they know they need parking, but it will give them the flexibility to design the type of buildings that aren't centered around parking, that don't have huge parking lots around them. So those are sort of my two top of mind things, and part of it is because I'm a parking nerd who studied parking in my master's, and because I'm a big pedestrian. So,
Jason, this may be a good question for you. If we go back outside of downtown, these are easy solutions maybe for downtown, but if we're going to somewhere on the Gore or Bovaird, where it's your cookie cutter kind of cliche suburban neighborhoods, how can you go back and fix that? How is that even possible? Or do you just kind of let it go and you try new with other places?
I think, again, recreating those pedestrian-friendly environments so important in the suburb. And it's interesting to find out, say, the Gore Corridor, for example. And there are a lot of immigrant businesses there, and the plazas and the places of worship. And the interesting finding from that area is that people tend to walk a lot, because they have multiple prayers in the place of worship. So people tend to live in that area, and they tend to bike, walk to those places, and relying on public transit. So I think building that transit connection is so important for the peripheral areas, because people can't really go beyond those areas without automobiles. So making the transit connections, making those areas pedestrian friendly, and also creating more meaningful and quality public spaces is important, because a lot of people, especially senior people, they don't actually find places to go in those areas. And I found out there's a heritage school place that was actually used as a shared space for many groups of people, church group or senior group or the immigrant groups and children, and for different programming during the day, all throughout the week. So it's wonderful, a shared public space created for the community. So that needs to be strengthened.
Well, the point you make actually brings something to mind. And I know we have some people here from the Bramptonist. Shinda Singh, who writes for the Bramptonist, had a really interesting article once. And I know it made the rounds, at least I know in the Punjabi Sikh community, where he was talking about, we keep talking about bike lanes downtown Brampton, But and an iconic image of Brampton is the old seniors with the turbans and the flowing beards riding their bikes. The bike lanes should probably be over by the Gore and Beauvert. Like, that's where we need them, because that's where a lot of cyclists are trying to utilize the space. So it kind of ties into when you're talking about the Gore Plaza and the need for more space and more access and more transportation options out there. And we kind of get stuck in this, well, cars rule. Well, yeah, they do, but and we can go a long way to fix that. But cycling is actually really big in the communities in the outskirts of the suburbs. I know we had a question there at the back, and then we had another one. So, Ravenna?
So Rowena Santos and Suburbia, the brave new Suburbia, has this bad rap of just being a place to live, and not necessarily a place to live and work. And so we've been focusing a lot of the discussion on, development and housing development, what that's going to look like, and possibly where people are going to walk to. But part of that is also the business community, and making sure that there are enough small business in the area and in the neighborhood for people actually to walk to. So what are your thoughts about maybe tapping into that diversity of our city and encouraging businesses and corporations to develop here in Brampton?
So I'm just going to repeat that for those viewing online who probably didn't hear anything you said. I'm going to bring it up very quickly. When we talk about suburbs, how does the workplace fit into that solution, right? More than just being a sleeping community and kind of walking back and forth to retail stores, how does the workplace, how do jobs, how does commerce and industry play into this? And it's an open question for anyone.
I can
Yusuf?
start with that. It's when we talk about employment within the GTA context, it tends to be very, very challenging, especially within the last 10 years, considering how much of the region is restructured from the effects of the recession and from, I guess, a shift away from the industrial tradition that this region has had. So one of the things that we're seeing has been a lot of jobs from the suburbs have been going into downtown Toronto, and those are kind of like the big office jobs. So the question then becomes, well, what's kind of developed within the region here? When we look forward, we're looking 25 years into the future, and there's a lot that can happen in that period, and there's definitely a lot of potential with the number of people that are coming here. They'll attract a number of businesses to come locate nearby, because the businesses themselves will want to be close to where their customers are or where other business partner companies might be. So I think part of that will happen naturally, and a lot of that will also happen through good policies towards employment. But I think looking forward, one of the things that's kind of interesting to see is, number one, you have the major institutional announcements. So you have the Peel Memorial Center, which is kind of being an anchor for a health cluster in the region. And you also have the Ryerson University coming in that'll kickstart quite a lot through the educational institutional sector. And when we also, I guess when I was looking at Brampton earlier, being new to the GTA, I didn't quite think about Brampton as being an arts and culture hub. But when you think about the Rose Theatre and how much, I guess, fanfare it has collected and how much of a sort of a draw it's become for the arts and culture industry as well, I think there's a lot of good bones here. And as the population develops, if the right policies are in place, I think Brampton can see itself grow from being a commuter community to more of a location where people not only will move here to live, but also work as well.
And with that, we're halfway through the program. If you have questions, please send us, either you can send it directly into the Facebook message of the video that's playing live right now, or you can tweet it at Linda Jeffrey, or to Spacing, who's live tweeting. I think Sean Marshall's over here live tweeting as well. Throw questions. We're seeing it, and then the questions get shot off to me, and then I'll ask. You're watching live on Brampton Focus. We thank them again for providing this live feed, and Lab B for the venue, and Spacing as our event partner. I'm going to throw the question to J. Paul, and then Chris, and then we'll work our way down.
My name's J. Paul Massey-Singh, and earlier both Graham and Jizzy brought up the topic of public spaces and how those become formative parts of neighborhoods and bringing communities together. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate on some of those ideas there and the role public spaces can play, not just from how they're utilized, but how they can be programmed within, what types of functions can they serve. And I think traditionally we've looked at public spaces as being something that's the responsibility of the municipality to provide to the public. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how these are things that the public themselves can drive and program and create for themselves.
So the question briefly, public spaces and how that can play a role in city building the suburbs. you see?
Yeah, I think public spaces actually play a huge role in community life, and we call them those spaces as the third places, like as contrast to the first place of home and the second place of workplace, and because those are the spaces that where people tend to have the social interactions and enhance the community life and through those spaces. So I found out, like especially with the ethnic groups. And they use, like, for example, places of worship or retailing as some kind of like public space. Then the next question would be, how do you make sure those spaces are inclusive and everyone outside of the community can also enjoy and share those spaces? So then municipalities could play a role there as well. Like say if there's any kind of like retailing, and can we think about like how do we create pedestrian friendly environment so everyone is welcome to go shopping in those places, and maybe there are some like public space, public square for people to sit and interact, and landscaping, sidewalk conditions to be conducive to pedestrian activities and interaction. So those are some of the ideas, and I really like the way that the schoolhouse, actually the Heritage House, only has capacity of 50 people, but then that has been used and shared by so many different groups, not just along the ethnocultural lines, but within the community, and it's actually very well used by different groups. And also public libraries, community centers, and those are the very important public spaces within this local context. And schools, public schools, that is also another very effective public space for parents and for children and the teachers to communicate with each other. Because we are coming from very diverse backgrounds, and there are many very diverse interests in terms of how to use the space. And there might be some other public arts program, for example, and create some kind of like activity nodes across the city, so people can appreciate different cultures and can enhance intercultural communication. So I think public space actually is so important in terms of retrofitting suburbia and creating a very inclusive community in the suburbs.
Grab, you've been nodding your head vigorously there for some points. You want to add anything?
There's just like a quick thought that comes to mind from my time working for the city of Regina. I think especially in a lot of new neighborhoods, we almost ask too much of some of our public spaces. We want them to do everything. So when we build new parks, they're expected to be able to host every sports game possible. They're expected to be public meeting spaces. And I think it almost ends up making them be too much, that the sum doesn't work out. And sometimes we need some of these smaller parks, especially in cities, because we have to recognize a busier park is a park someone wants to be at rather than a less busy park. And when we start to build these super parks in all of our new neighborhoods, it can make it more challenging for them to be the types of public spaces we want them to be. So thinking about how we create different types of more useful public spaces, I think, is an important thing for us as planners and communities.
Well, on that note, we've been kind of going with the city our own Parks and Rec plan and master plan, and kind of going through a lot of these different exercises. How would you apply that to rec centers? You know, what's an optimal rec center in a suburb?
I have no idea how you would answer that. I mean, I think you want a rec center that like draws people there on its own as well. So I mean, it should have the activities that people need. I mean, there's tons of servicing, and it can be challenging in communities that are growing as quickly as Brampton, I think, to offer all the services and keep up with that growth. But I mean, obviously, you have to try your hardest. So expanding services to go with population growth, I think, is number one with your community centers. But creating the spaces, like just good spaces for people to gather, I think is part of a community center that we sometimes lose. They become this, like, it has to be a swimming pool, it has to have the gym, and then we'll worry about the details. But I think those details are what matter, and that's where the community comes in, and making sure that we get those details right.
I know this is just a personal experience, and it's actually kind of very sad. The best public spaces I remember when we were growing up were surface parking lots. As terrible as that sounds, right? But that's where we played street hockey. That's where we put up the nets and play basketball. That's where we played cricket games on surface parking lots. So it's almost sad in a way, but that's a very suburban experience.
Just adding to what Graham just said, I think the creating those rec centers or public spaces, we need to be mindful about the flexibility and provide flexibility in terms of programming, in terms of different users of those spaces. And we have, like, I know there in Brampton, we have already got 6 to 7 cricket fields, probably this largest amount of cricket fields in Canada. So it's interesting that we put into, like, we consider flexibility in terms of different users. I think that's important. Just adding to that point.
So I see the hands going up, and I'll circle my way around, and also the questions that are coming online. I've been kind of including them as we talk. Chris, I think you had a question there. Yes, Chris, go ahead.
Hi everyone, my name is Chris, and I'm really excited that tonight.
And keep it short, Chris. Come on, please.
It's hard. The best part about tonight is that it was free to enter. I think that's really important to have free and open public events. So my question is about transit and how important transit is for Brampton and our region. You know, sometimes I think we just get really used to our commute, we just kind of put up with it, but I think the residents of Brampton want transit action now and shovels in the ground. So what are your transit ideas for Brampton? Any specific projects or things we should be doing right now and not waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for?
So the question very briefly was about transit in Brampton and what are the projects we should be focusing on. I'll open to the floor.
I suspect we all have something to say. I'll try to be quick. I think just like one thing is, for now, buses work great. So I mean, like, take advantage of what you can do with buses. But number one with buses is making them easy to take. And I think that's about transit in general, is getting headways down on routes that make it an easy option to take. I mean, coming from the city of Regina, I suspect transit was largely the same. If you want to take transit, you have to plan around taking transit. You can't just take transit. And what will make transit successful and allow people to live without a car, especially people who are forced to live without a car because they can't drive for whatever reason, is making transit easy. So things like 5 or 10 minute headways, so that when you walk out your door, if you see that bus and you just missed it because whatever, it was ahead of schedule or something, you're not panicking because it's another half hour for the next bus. So I think, to me, that's number one, is for major routes, getting appropriate headways that allow people to rely on transit rather than have to plan around transit.
I will just talk about it briefly, then I'll pass it to the expert, Yusuf. I think the local connection is important to ensure the transit that support local connection and also the regional connection. It's not just about this neighborhood, this community, but beyond Brampton, how do we connect with the rest of the GTA? For example, today, it took me 2.5 hours to come from my school in downtown Toronto all the way to Brampton. And because I can't rely on GO train, I have to go back to Markham. There's no regional connection, so I have to drive. And then the 2.5 hours to come here. And then after that, I need to drive back to Markham. That's easy, because I take 407.
Well, when I think about transit, my big thing is always network. I think transit works best when it's part of a network, and that feeds into what both of you were saying. It's having, number one is having that frequency, making sure that it's predictable, you know when it's going to be coming and you know when to get on, but also having those connections regionally and within the city as well. So for me, I've always had this, whenever I discuss transit with people, it's always, you can't just talk about a line here or a line there. You really have to think about it as a whole system and decide how would the whole network fit together and how do people get around the city, not just from one destination and one origin.
Actually, if you indulge me for a bit, where would you put an LRT in Brampton?
I'll defer that to the planners.
I'll like take it.
Be brave. Be brave.
I mean, like, I think to me it seems relatively obvious that like things like Main Street and Queen Street make a lot of sense for starters. I don't know that it has to be LRT necessarily, but I think those are your spines of a transit system, and things like Steeles also make sense. So none of these might not need to be right away. I mean, I wish you had approved the HMLRT because I think it would be great. And I think one of the things with approving it is it would show commitment to developers as well. So when you talk about wanting to attract new development downtown, is making those types of commitments, I think, matters to developers. Right now, it's easy to be like, well, Brampton doesn't really care about transit. Let's just like build another subdivision. That's easier. People are going to drive. Driving's easy in Brampton. It's going to keep being easy to drive, so we'll build another subdivision. So I think, to me, identifying those big spines, obviously the two that have been talked about all along make the most sense immediately because they have they run through downtown. So they're coming somewhere that matters. But I mean, things like Steeles will make sense in the future. All of your major spines will make sense in the future. And I think starting to build good transit on those routes and getting people used to relying on transit for those routes will help.
It's a kind of a follow-up question there, and again, a wide open question, and I think there's merits to both sides of this argument. Do you plan something like an LRT, which is a huge investment, to either A, encourage more transit users, or B, and this might be a false dichotomy of sorts, but B, to encourage economic development and putting in places what can encourage more economic development? And that seems to be one of the gists of the arguments here. Is there any opinions on that, or even research? Is it false dichotomy? Is it mutually exclusive of one another? How would you answer a question like that?
I mean, transit does both, or good transit should do both. It should attract new ridership and it should attract economic development. So I don't think it's necessarily one or the other. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, good transit projects should be able to do both. Otherwise, I think one of the challenges with projects like this is sort of like chicken and the egg. Which do you need first, the ridership or the project? And I think municipalities more and more have to be willing to just put their foot forwards and take the risk. Otherwise, ridership will never come.
Yes. All right, everyone, calm down. Take it easy. So there's tons of hands up. I do have a rough order. It's not a very good one, but there's questions that came from online, and 2 or 3 people have actually asked this. We're talking about public spaces, and we're talking about density and retrofitting. So I'm just going to verbatim this question. How do we retrofit suburbs to have more density when even the gentlest density sparks big negative arguments from neighbors and communities? So how do you battle NIMBYism when some people have moved, and Matt's shaking his head. It's like, you don't battle, you move to Toronto. Well, that has its own issues. It just escalated. Yeah. So, let me rephrase that a bit more too. It's how do communities appropriately engage with decision makers, and decision makers engage with communities to ensure that the best policy is put forward? Again, open question to the floor.
I think this is really like the part of the planning process. Like as planners, we talk about how to engage people and how to conduct public consultations with community. So the challenge here is that with such a large diversity of our community members, and there are so many interests, and there are many different ways or approaches to engage the community. And some of the examples that I can use here is that, like when I was interviewing planners across the GTA, I was interviewing the business people in those suburban areas. It's like a two-way communication, and planners always like talk about how challenging that is to outreach to the community because no one showed up in the public consultation meetings. They found out because why? Because those are small businesses. They couldn't find time if they need to come out at night, or they have to close down their business for 2 hours, and they couldn't make it. And there are some other cultural preferences, or they are not comfortable speaking in front of 500 people at the public consultation meetings. So there are all kinds of challenges in terms of how planners can outreach to the community effectively, and also from the local community members, like the merchants or the immigrant communities. They tend to talk about, yes, they are not consulted, they are not aware of any municipal agendas. So I think there's a gap there, like how do you actually effectively engage people? And I think listening to the needs of the community is so important for planners and for municipalities. So I think that's like dealing with NIMBYism. Again, it's like we need to find the common ground. We need to identify those shared interests. It's difficult, it's challenging at many times. But again, as planners, as municipal staff, what we can do is to listen to those needs.
So we have about 15, 20 minutes left. Time flies by when you're having fun. For those viewing online, keep sending the questions. They're playing a role in how I dictate the questions up here. And for those in the crowd, I know your hands are up. I think you were next, yes.
I actually have 2 we simply, and we talk about developing the arts and culture and pedestrian ways and all that. But our hospital, even with the new facility that opened, our hospital is not able to accommodate our current population. And so when the province and when everybody pressures Brampton to grow, where is the safety in place to put things on hold until we have facilities that can accommodate people? Because healthcare, that Brampton Civic is constantly in gridlock. And then how do we also protect places like our farmland? I mean, I'm all for growth, but I also don't want to end up with all our arable land gone and university here, and we can't keep, if kids get sick, where are they going to go? To the hospital where that's in gridlock? So who protects that? And who helps with the planning around stuff like that?
You want to take that, Yusuf?
Sure. I think that's a very good question, and that plays into part of that visioning exercise of trying to understand the outside forces coming into the city of, you know, you're expecting a lot of people to come to Brampton, and then how do you manage that internally? I'm not sure to what extent, I guess, the rules are around figuring out how many more facilities you need from the province's side, because a big hospital is that usually comes. I don't know how much of that's a municipal decision versus how much of that is a provincial decision. But I think we hear that a lot, not just here, but also in downtown Toronto when we've done some of the planning for the downtown there. And speaking with some of the hospitals, they're saying, you know, we're meant to be specialized care units, and yet there's so many people moving to this area that we're now having to deal with the general public. So I think that's going to be a separate process that both the province and municipalities go through to see. I mean, when we plan for that sort of growth, we generally assume there's a level of population servicing that's going to be put in place. And I think that's part of the visioning and the discussions that people, the municipalities and the province have together to decide how do we best move forward with accommodating all of those needs.
Any other takers? No? Okay. I think there's a question. Yes, the gentleman with the hat.
I stumbled upon this event complete accident because my friend actually rent space out here. I love growing up in Brampton. I love how it is, but what I noticed is that there's a lack of something for young people. You guys talk about economic growth in the LTR. I understand that, especially how young people divert to Toronto as the default. I'd like to see the Brampton kind of thrive and grow, especially how it's my home. But I don't see that happening, especially with all these subdivisions that are meant for families and young kids. Like, yeah, parks are nice, but like, you can't do anything with that. You can't grow, you can't have fun, and also because of our economic status, like young people and being almost broke because of university and also having that work, you don't have those times, but when you do have that time, it's not pretty towards it. You try to find ways to get out of that. But I also want to kind of comment on how you guys talked about transit. How do you guys actually kind of do that in a more personal way? Because I've had many issues when it comes to public handling with customer service, as well as the actual transit operators, and also the bus station as well. I'm hearing many different times, I'm hearing at times estimates, so that if I get there 5 minutes on time, it could already be gone by then, or if I come there on time, 5 minutes late, 10 minutes late, and it's like, how do you guys kind of build that trust with us? Because as young people, we try to get out of cars, because we cannot trust you guys with the transportation, with the economic growth, the development, or anything that is for us. Like, there are some hidden gems here in Brampton, but they're hidden. They're hard to find. I mean, especially how now that we're spread out, we like to bring friends from Toronto, Moncton, Scarborough, down to you. We want to try connecting them to what we like, what we preserve. So how do you guys plan to kind of develop that nowadays?
So I'm going to repeat that. Great question, by the way. And I will break it down much simpler, but it's a very important question. When you consider a city like Brampton, and this is common for all suburbs, where our median average or median age is about 34, 35 years old. So it's very young, super young. Suburbs weren't really designed for people of that age, right, or younger, young people to engage in their city and their urban landscape. So what can suburbs do better to engage youth And that goes from transit to public spaces to education to and to future growth, and to call Brampton home and not to just drive down the Gardiner and go to Toronto and spend your money and days there. So how do you better engage the youth in suburbs? Open question. I'm expecting all three of you to answer this one, actually. This is very meaningful and important to, I think, the city we're in right now.
I just want to have a comment instead of an answer or a toolkit. I think it's so important to engage youth, the population, different population. When I do research on diversity, I look at different forms of diversity. Could be along the lines of ethnocultural diversity, could be gender, could be age, and could be people with different abilities. So I think youth and young kids and senior people and men and women and different users have different kind of like perception of the space, and also the different very diverse needs of urban space. So what you just talked about and exactly was echoed in one of my interviews. The gentleman who has been living in Brampton for over 30 years, he raised his kids here, but then he said how sad that is. My kids, after their university, naturally they just move out to Toronto. He has a vision of Brampton as a big city in 20 years, and every young the young kids want to stay here in Brampton. They want to find jobs here. They want to go to university here. There's a reason why Ryerson's moving to Brampton then. He's actually talking about exactly the same thing, like having the voice of the youth population to be heard by municipalities, and actively engaging them in this kind of like city building process in the suburbs. And it's so important. I don't have any solution right now, but I think it's important. I just acknowledge that.
Yeah, I don't think I have any big solutions either, because ultimately I think engagement comes down to the commitment of the municipality, its politicians, and its staff. But I mean, number one, I think making it easier to engage is the number one step. So it should be easier to comment, to participate in planning processes, and it should be something enjoyable, I guess, to a degree. Like, it shouldn't be a chore to have to go out. So I think events like this are a good start, and learning how to promote them and doing more of these. So I think this is a great first step. But it almost has to be part not just of the politicians leading this, but city staff as well as they go through planning exercises. And I think they are with the Brampton Future Forward program. But I mean, to me, that's number one, is just breaking down the barriers to actually engaging in your city and the planning activities that are happening in your city.
Yusuf, any final thoughts?
I don't know. I think that covered it for the most part. I kind of see your sentiment. It's not a problem that's unique to Brampton. I think that it's really, really something that goes through a lot of different municipalities, and engaging youth has been a huge challenge for planners everywhere. So I think another one thing could be you reaching out to your planners and saying, hey, this would help me engage better with the city as well. If you have some ideas as well.
Well, the mayor loves to say this line, Madam Mayor, correct me if I'm wrong. She's already giving me that look. That decisions are made by those who show up. And I think a mistake that young people, and I'm relatively young, but when I was even younger, the mistake we made is we never really put ourselves into the decision-making process, reach out to our elected officials, reach out to our planning division. It's as easy as an email. They'll respond back, our folks at the planning department. And I think that's the same with a lot of different suburbs and a lot of different communities or cities, and that goes up provincially and federally as well. If they're good at their job, they will respond. And so that's another way of kind of engaging. I know that you don't really necessarily want to put all the onus on just residents. There's a duty for decision makers and leaders to kind of push forward a good agenda that includes the entire city. I know there's lots of other questions. You right there.
So actually, just building on that, I live in Brampton and work in Markham and travel a lot. On the days where I can't get a limo to the airport, it's easier for me to walk to Mount Pleasant Coast Station, to take it to Union, to get to City Center, and fly to wherever I need to go. So there's that. But also there's been a lot of jealousy in my mind when I get to work in Markham that is clearly deciding to be a live, work, play area, and that it seems to have had a cohesive vision of what had wanted to be for quite some time, and pushing that vision out in all of its forms. I remember 10 years ago going to a Viva website, and it wouldn't just give you transit information, but it would give you imagery of what the place was supposed to look like, and that's what it looks like now. So, and living in the Toronto area, I never really believed that things would get planned and then get done. So when talking about participation and youth being involved, one of the things that I see is actually having a cohesive vision from government that's consistent, that survives elections, and that is broadcast out to the population. And that's one of the big things that I don't see.
So I think there is a bigger push to have a collective vision, but that is somewhat true. Planning people don't have to nod. Don't worry, you don't have to acknowledge anything. But the point being, you know, and I guess this question goes, and we get the example of Markham, but there are other communities out there, and have you seen over the years a bigger trend of having more cohesive city designing, planning, master plans of a grand vision that's more than just cookie cutter development? And where do you see it going in the future?
The one I know of, Brampton, I keep hearing about Future Ready. So I think that's one of those examples.
I will say, like Markham is another example again, because Markham is famous for its new urbanist neighborhood development for the last 10, 20 years. I think it's really why that worked in Markham but not in other places. The important thing to learn from Markham is that because they make those regulations ready for either for conventional suburban development or for new urbanist neighborhood development. So they make those parallel codes. So my broad answer to that question is that make sure we have our regulation, there's some flexibility there to revisit our existing regulations. So if things are happening on the ground, and monitor it and let things happen naturally. Sometimes wonderful things, amazing things will come out. And because if we look at the new urbanist development in Markham, it's so complicated. It really, like the developer industry needs to be attracted to the new practice in terms of financing, in terms of lending practices, and in terms of the zoning bylaw codes. And the city and municipality needs to be creative and innovative, and get things ready to attract the industry and attract the stakeholders. So I think it's that again. The point is to be flexible enough in terms of regulation.
I think the only thing I'll add is that a big part of this, I think, comes down to political will as well, and a lot of cities are willing to put a vision in place, but then not stand by it. So I mean, I speak from experience living in the city of Regina, where we had what looks like a very progressive official community plan, but then all that happens is greenfield growth. And we can number off countless municipalities that have a vision to be the most sustainable, most green, most diverse community, but few that then put that into practice. So I think that's number one, is holding politicians to account that do or don't put in the vision they say they will. And then, I don't know where else I was going, but yeah, we'll start with that.
Yeah, you didn't plan out a vision of your answer, and then you lost track of it towards the end. Okay, I'm just going to make a quick note. It's 8:30, but we're not ending. We'll keep going for another 15 minutes. Is that okay with everyone here? I know there's tons of hands. I think we're going to leave it to 3 more questions, and I hate being that guy. I know you've had your hand for a while up, and I kept ignoring you, so go ahead.
Thanks. I'm Rhonda Taylor with the Brampton, and this is the publication we use. My question is about storefronts, mom and pop shops, and places that are not necessarily the public places that you're talking about, but places that people still want to go to, people still want to visit. We have a bad stigma in the city of Brampton, and it was mentioned before, that people will just end up wanting to leave if you want to do something. And a lot of the money that is in Brampton, I mean 600,000 people leaves Brampton, turning Brampton into a sleeper city. When it comes down to our restaurants, there's a complaint about customer service. Yet the fact of the matter is we have hundreds and hundreds of great locations. Same thing when it comes down to things to do. We have a minimal amount of, like maybe there's just a small few art galleries, things like that, just because there's that stigma once again of, oh my God, it is the suburb of Brampton. So number one, how important is it to have storefronts that are, or I guess just a variety of stores of, I guess, private enterprises, of small businesses, and how does that shape neighborhood development as well as city development as well?
So I actually wanted to touch on something similar to this in a previous question about, it was about like people being able to set up businesses in Brampton. And I think that's actually one of the biggest challenges we've seen in our suburbs is we're not building the type of commercial spaces that allow for small businesses and entrepreneurships. I mean, it's almost like we build communities around power centers now, and that's not necessarily a place where an entrepreneur can get a foothold because the lease rates are expensive, they're meant for big businesses. So we need to find a better way to incorporate and require spaces that are conducive to small businesses right within our new neighborhoods as we build them. But I think I'm gonna hand this off to Juicy because I think she's more of an expert on these types of things than I am.
Okay. Yes, I just came back from a conference, International Planning Conference, ACSP conference in Denver. I was in a panel that talks about Main Street retailing, and a lot of cities in the States, and actually they have witnessed the big decline in terms of Main Street retailing, and we are still lucky that we in the Greater Toronto area we still have a lot of like thriving small businesses and Main Street retailing or strip malls. And however, the thing is that a lot of those strip malls, for example, they are considered as eyesore. They are also considered to be, they are slated to redevelopment. So a lot of those small businesses, they are actually under great pressure and being redeveloped or being displaced and etc. So I think it's so important that we understand the contribution of small businesses and entrepreneurship, especially for immigrant businesses. And lots of stuff happening in the suburbs is along those like two-story strip malls. And those are the kind of like, there's a strong social connections, and business have been vibrant in those areas for 20, 30 years, based on my interviews and based on my observations there. And they are considered the cancer market in the suburb. And so it's really like, you can't just destroy that social fabric to replace those places with larger corporation development or redevelopment, that kind of thing. So need to be really careful to protect those small businesses.
Any other takers?
Sure. I was working on a study like about 2 years ago where we're kind of looking at what the future of retail is going to be. And somebody mentioned a really good point about how retail may be moving towards the extremes a bit. This is kind of more on the optimistic side, but it was looking at how we've been building these power centers for so long, and with e-commerce and changes in retailing coming in, those power centers are really the ones being the hardest hit. And so what you see is like the really big malls are gonna start to consolidate more of those tenants, and we may be moving towards having more of a focus on neighborhood retail again. So I think there will be some opportunities coming up in the future as sort of that shift happens. So I'm personally more optimistic about the opportunities that come out, but it's going to be really important to make sure that we have the land use policies in place to make sure that you can really support that.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I think at the neighborhood level, those small businesses, they can actually work as a public space, even though they are privately owned. But you can see lots of like cafe or coffee shops or small restaurants, and where this the places where people tend to socialize or interact with each other. So there's really down to that neighborhood level. They are not competitive with the big bosses, but then there is like this social value in addition to the economic benefits.
So I haven't taken any questions on this side of the room. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I live in Brampton. It's a planned community. There are 5 community centres my children could always walk to, not like the soccer centre which you're going to drive to. And one of the observations is that the smaller centres attract people to go there. That people walk. The seniors ride their bikes, the senior agents, right? That they're under pressure because of lack of capital maintenance, actually. One of those centres, if one is to close in Brampton, as the paper said the other day, could become a community hub, because young people will be engaged when they have a place to meet. What the recreational model we have in Brampton is very institutionalized. You have to register for a program and be in a registered program. The Y is an exception. On a Friday night, you can go for a drop-in. and it's only $1, I think. They get 200 kids out. But we have nothing in Bramalea, perhaps in some of the newer Springdale areas. And I would recommend looking at creating hubs, a community hub, where you can actually hang out and have community-run programs rather than professionally, recreationally structured programs. I think that would engage kids.
So I'm going to just
paraphrase that. What role do community hubs have in suburbs? And it's not something that's very common here, where you can just drop in and hang out. Like spaces like Lab B here, where we are today, they're very rare in a city like Toronto. Sorry, a city like Brampton. Toronto has these a dime a dozen. It's Matt's fault. He's here. He keeps looking at me. You know, those beady Toronto eyes. No, but if in Brampton, where we lack spaces that they have in Toronto, right, or in other bigger municipalities, or other denser municipalities, what can suburbs do to create community hubs? And what are some models and examples that have worked elsewhere that could make sense here?
You can start.
It's a good old-fashioned Canadian standoff.
Okay. I think community hubs, absolutely. Absolutely. I think we are lacking these spaces. But in fact, I think community members, like it's really like a bottom-up process. We need to really have this kind of like voice being heard. If we see the needs of the importance of the importance of community hubs, and I think the Ontario government has the community hubs initiative, and trying to build those hubs closer to, for example, transit, closer to community services. So people going there not just for recreational purposes, but also for personal services, for example, or medical services. And it's easy, it's accessible. I think accessibility is so important in terms of community hubs in the suburb. Yusuf, you want to talk about that?
No, Yusuf's hesitant. No, there's no force. I'm not forcing you if you want to take it. Go ahead.
I don't really have many thoughts on community hubs.
Great. Does the Ryerson Institute for City Building have any thoughts?
I think we've touched. It was more of a statement than a question, and I sort of agree. I mean, community hubs are incredibly important, and getting them well, making them accessible, as Juicy talked about, for everybody is incredibly important. So, I mean, I don't think there's much more to say than that fact.
I think that's the first time someone's made a statement that everyone's agreed, like right off the bat, and lost for words. Yes, political will. Madam Mayor Jeffrey, political will. Yes. So we're going to take one last question. Your hand's been up all night, and I've been ignoring you. I apologize. Go ahead. Last question.
All right. So my name is Vince. Historically, we've kind of built our communities around the idea, let's build a factory and build a community around it. We now live in a post-industrial world, knowing the pitfalls of that kind of mentality. Unfortunately, nowadays, we're kind of falling into a trap where getting a university is the new fashion. What kind of ideas do you believe are the pitfalls, and what Brampton might be able to avoid?
Yeah, I guess you want to, the Ryerson guys, you can say conflict of interest and just not answer. But Yusuf, you're quite the last one. I'm interested to hear your opinions on this.
Just trying to wrap my head around pitfalls specifically, not in terms of.
Like basically, when it came to factories, we kind of put all our eggs in one basket. And communities we've now seen in post-industrial society like Detroit fall apart because they all put everything into that one institution. Now that it's universities that are the new fashion, do you think there's any kind of pitfalls that Brampton might be able to avoid?
So I think diversifying suburbs and the work that can be done here.
I think that's really the key thing, is to work towards diversifying the economic base of the city, and we kind of view Brampton as part of the region of Peel as well. So you're right here with Mississauga, and Mississauga is going through a very interesting phase in itself, is that it's a completely built-out community. It's no longer the traditional suburban greenfield environment. So they're going to go through a transition, and that transition is slowly going to work its way up to Brampton as well. So I think you have Ryerson, you have the healthcare cluster that's kind of being planned in place as well. And I think things will slowly build around that into the future. And one of the things a lot of the stuff we've been studying lately is why is office, why are the knowledge industries, the professional services clustering so much in downtown Toronto when there has been such a history of that out in the 905 as well. And the things we constantly hear is we want to be close to our employees, or we want to be accessible to our employees. And with congestion where it is, with a whole new generation of workers coming in that are currently in downtown Toronto, it is the fashion to be downtown, and they'll probably stay there for a long time. But when we look at the demographics of it, millennials are peak millennial era, where like most of them are clustered, is around 26 years old. 5-10 years from now, that's going to change, and if current patterns hold, we're going to be spreading out across the 905. So it's going to be interesting to see over the next 10 years how the location preferences of different commercial operators in these knowledge industries change in terms of all the different transit and transportation investments, and where they decide they need to be close to their labor force. And I think Brampton's going to be very key. Both Brampton and Mississauga are going to be key in that you're not just on the side of Toronto anymore, you're kind of central to Toronto, York, and Halton and Hamilton on the other side as well. So I think it's going to be an interesting to see how the demographics play out over the next 10 years and where Brampton fits into that.
Well, to add to that note too, is Brampton smack dab in the innovation corridor, which is something we love saying, I know, at the mayor's office, but and also that the city's been selling as a value proposition for Brampton, is that we're very uniquely located, where it's a short trip to Waterloo, a short trip to Toronto, versus if you talk to the folks at Waterloo, they hate driving to Toronto because it's a 2-hour trip one way, and then they got to watch the clock to get out. Whereas in Brampton, they may not face the same issues, and I think it's a driving factor in what Ryerson wants to do here as well. So I think Brampton has itself in a unique position where we may not succumb to the same, being a factory town or being a university town and kind of just being in a little silo. But yeah, Jesse, you want to end?
Yeah, I think if my understanding is correct, and I think the pitfalls you refer to is about the segregation of the land uses, and then you group those industrial uses in one area and it's basically isolated from the rest of the city. And I think bringing in Ryerson University campus to Brampton, the one important thing is to diversify the uses and bring in retailing, bring in other uses, institutional uses, and providing employment opportunities. And I'm using the idea, like I'm just using something like some idea from Christopher Alexander, a world-renowned urban designer, architect, and planner. He talks about the creation of a university campus as the marketplace of ideas. I think that's very important. What does that really mean? It's like campus space is not the Ivy Tower. It's not just about doing research and isolated those academic research work within the campus. It's actually it should enhance the connections with the community. So I think in downtown Toronto, Ryerson has a reputation as a city builder. We are building not just a physical environment, but we are building that community connection. So once we are here in Brampton, we should diversify the uses and make this campus like connected with transit, for example, so people can easily accessible to community members. And we also actually should diversify the uses on campus and trying to make that linkage with the rest of the city. So I think to avoid that segregation of land uses, we should think about the diversity of uses and also the role of university can play.
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of the same things there. I think just making sure that if and when you get to university campus, that it's a catalyst for more than just a campus, and taking advantage of that opportunity. And I think that requires a lot of things. I mean, we talked about transit. I think the location is incredibly important, and getting all of those things right are the things that will allow the campus to be more than just a campus for Brampton.
So that ends the Q&A part, and what I want to do is to sign off and to end this. I'm going to ask each of the same question. What can the 905, or Brampton specifically, or the 905 in general, do to tell its own story better? Right? And how do suburbs start telling its own story rather than being told at, right? Like, this is what you guys are.
I think there's a lot of good news stories to tell in the suburbs, especially when suburbs choose to take the initiative and make change happen. So I think that's really it, is making Brampton making the change it wants to see happen and then celebrating that change, because you'll get the celebration from it. I mean, you look at communities like Waterloo that sort of has like pushed the growth plan further than any other community. They've been aggressive about transit and they get a lot of acclaim for it. Their story tells naturally. So if Brampton wants its story to be told and told well, it's about Brampton putting its best foot forwards and making the change happen that it wants to see happen. So that's everything from politicians doing a better job engaging community. We've heard that's a challenge here. So how can that be done better? And that's all politicians. And it's how do we make sure that the vision of its residents actually makes its way onto the planning paper? Because the change is hard. I mean, like, as much as we all want to see change, it is hard to implement. So getting the community support and actually making it happen, I think, is sort of the big next step.
I think so important to, let me put it this way. I think listening to the needs of the community, that's a key piece. Building a synergy, the public sector, private sector, community stakeholders, everyone has a role to play. And listening to the needs of the community is so important. And then implement the plan. If we have a vision, that vision is based on robust evidence and data and evidence-informed decisions, then implement the plans. Do something and act on it, right? So that's my final words. Thank you.
I think with Brampton, there's something to be said about someone like Larry Beasley, who's been a very celebrated planner, deciding he wants to come here and try this visioning process that he has. So I think there's a lot to look forward to. But I come from the school of thought of like being that active resident as well in my community. And so for people in the 905, it's one of those things like it's a two-way street where people also need to have their own vision and they need to have that vision heard and they need to engage with their cities to get that vision out.
So with that, I want to thank our three panelists. A round of applause. Well, it's not easy taking time out of the work week. I think everyone's going to bed very late today, so we apologize for this going on. But a lot of great questions, and the interaction from the crowd is wonderful. For those that are reviewing online, thank you for taking part and sending questions over on Twitter and Facebook. We want to thank Brampton Focus for providing the live feed for today that Spacing Magazine has been kind enough to share as well as on the mayor's page and other stakeholders. We want to thank our media partners at Bramptonist for being here as well, and the many people that were live tweeting. Sean, we saw your live tweets coming through. Thank you very much for that. We want to thank Lab B for providing this space. And again, the story of Lab B is actually kind of a story of Brampton, of this scrappy little kid fighting it out, and they actually just recently grew into this space. So again, a round of applause for Lab B for... This is amazing. Thank you, Harpreet, Rahul, Jesse, everyone else has been very active. Again, thank you, Madam Mayor, for allowing us to take time out of our busy schedule to put on this event. Thank you very much. So with that, I know there's a lot of questions, a lot of people that have their hands up. For the viewers online, there's a lot of questions that I wasn't able to get to as well. Send your comments to the Future Ready campaign that the City of Brampton is putting on. Just Google it, Future Ready Brampton. There's a web page where you can provide your ideas to the city. That it's going to be part of the process in planning out the master plan for Brampton and the planning vision of this city as we kind of take the brave leap forward and building a brave new suburbia. Well, actually not a suburb, a city, a full-fledged city, and being able to stand on our own 2 feet. So with that, thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you all at the next Speaker Series event. There's one planned for one later on in this month, and that will be made public when it's ready. So with that, thank you very much. Jaskar and Sandhu, Graham, JC, and Yusuf, thank you. Take care. So long.
Gotta make sure you don't